The river is slow here, wide, brown, heavy, with silt from a continent Alexander has dragged behind him like a cloak. Opis, 324 BC. On the far bank, the camps stretch in disciplined geometry. Tents, fires, corrals, supply wagons, the machinery of conquest at rest. But the air doesn't feel like rest. It feels like a fuse. A soldier steps forward, then another. Hard faces, sun-cracked lips, hands that have killed for a decade. They aren't begging, they aren't cheering. They are daring the most successful warlord on earth to admit what everyone can already see. The Macedonians are done, not with marching, not with fighting, with him. Alexander stands in full view of his army and announces what should have been an honorable gesture. Veteran soldiers will be discharged and sent home with rewards. A victory lap. A closing ceremony for the old guard. Instead, the line breaks. The men who followed him across Asia erupt with anger, not gratitude, not relief. They throw accusations like stones. They say he is replacing them, that he is sending Macedonians away to make room for Persians, that he has forgotten who carried him here. The empire holds its breath, because this isn't a riot in some conquered city. This is a mutiny at the center of the conquering machine. The one thing a king cannot allow. And Alexander, who has been stabbed, shot, nearly drowned in blood, who has stared down walls and elephants and deserts, looks at his own soldiers and sees the only enemy that can still take everything from him. Not Persia, not India, the men who made him. The story of Opis is not the story of a battle. It is the story of a bond snapping under the weight of success. To understand why, you have to rewind through the illusion that Alexander's campaigns were one long victory parade. You have to see what victory actually costs when it lasts too long. Alexander begins this war as a young king with a small, lethal army and an inherited mission. His father, Philip II, built the Macedonian war machine and aimed it east. Alexander fires it. At first, it is clean. Greece is controlled. Asia is the prize. The Persians, rich and vast and overconfident, meet a force that fights like a single organism. Granicus. Issus, Gaugamela. Each name becomes a rung on a ladder out of the old world. But conquest expands like a fire. It doesn't stop because you want to stop. It stops when it runs out of fuel. And Alexander's fuel is men. For years, his Macedonians live inside steel and dust. They march until their feet split. They cross deserts that erase columns. They build bridges, dig siege ramps, drag engines and bury friends. They take cities and watch them burn. They accept that their lives are currency. They do it because the bargain is clear. Follow Alexander and the world opens. Wealth, land, glory, a place in history. But history is not a stable place to live. The longer the war goes, the more the bargain changes. Alexander doesn't just defeat Persia. He inherits it. That's the pivot. Winning a throne is not the same thing as ruling what comes with it. Persia is not one enemy. It is a system. Administrators, satraps, taxes, roads, rituals, court etiquette. Aristocrats who know how to keep a giant empire from collapsing under its own size. Destroy the system, and you get chaos. Use the system, and you become, in some sense, its heir. Alexander chooses inheritance. He begins to dress differently. He adopts elements of Persian court life. He promotes Persians into positions of power. He requires his Macedonians, men raised on the rough equality of the campfire and the phalanx, to watch him move through a world of bowing, ceremony, and distance. He is evolving from a war leader into an imperial king. To Alexander, it is strategy. To his Macedonians, it is betrayal dressed in silk. And then come the marriages at Susa, mass weddings that bind Macedonian officers to Persian noblewomen. Another attempt to fuse cultures, to weld a new ruling class together with blood and contract. To Alexander, it's architecture. Build an empire that outlives the spear. To many Macedonians, it feels like dilution, like being absorbed by the thing they conquered. Then he goes further. He trains Persian youths in Macedonian warfare. He arms them, drills them, shapes them into something that looks uncomfortably familiar: replacements. They are called the epigoni, successors. The word itself is a blade. It doesn't just describe a unit. It implies an end. After years of conquest, the Macedonian army has become old. It is filled with men who have been campaigning since they were boys. Their wounds are permanent. Their friends are gone. Their patience has been stretched thin by distance, heat, and the sickening logic of endless war. The world keeps expanding, and home keeps shrinking. They have followed Alexander farther than any Macedonian imagined possible. They have crossed into India and finally refused to go farther at the Ephasis River, not because they are cowards, but because they are human. They have reached the edge of what an army can endure, and still remain an army. Alexander turns back, but not without cost. The return is a grind through hardship that feels like punishment. Men die by the thousands in the march through Gedrosia, a brutal landscape that doesn't care about greatness. Every death adds pressure to a question no one says out loud. Why are we still doing this? By the time Alexander reaches Mesopotamia, he is not just a conqueror. He is an employer of fatigue, a collector of resentments. And then he makes the announcement at Opis. Veterans will go home. On paper, this is mercy, a release, a reward. In the ears of exhausted Macedonians, it sounds like exile, like being dismissed from the only thing that still gives their suffering meaning. Like being replaced by Persians, while Alexander stays and rules a new hybrid empire where Macedonian privilege is no longer the axis of the world. This is where the mutiny begins, not as a sudden explosion, but as the final crack in a long fracture. The soldiers shout. They refuse. They demand that if Alexander loves Persians so much, he should let Persians do the fighting. They spit out the idea that he is no longer truly Macedonian. It is an ugly moment because it's not just insubordination, it's intimacy. Only people close enough to love you can say something that precise. And Alexander's response is immediate. He does not negotiate. He does not soften. He does not pretend the authority of a king is a conversation. He erupts. This is the part that makes Opis feel less like politics and more like violence. Alexander, who has controlled armies and cities, now has to control his own image in real time. If he yields, he teaches every soldier in every camp that shouting works, that the army can bend the king. So he does the opposite. He identifies leaders, ringleaders, the mouthpieces, the men brave enough or reckless enough to stand out. He orders their arrest, and then he orders their execution, not later, not quietly, in front of the army, because a mutiny is a fire, and the fastest way to kill a fire is to starve it of oxygen. He makes an example of the men who tried to turn grievance into power. This is the shocking truth of Alexander's greatness. It is not built only on genius. It is built on the willingness to be ruthless when sentiment becomes a threat. The moment those men die, the army feels the floor drop away. The Macedonians expected anger. They did not expect the king to cut into his own flesh. Because that's what those soldiers are. His. The old guard. The companions of the road. Alexander doesn't stop there. He withdraws. He locks the Macedonians out of his presence and floods his court with Persians. He elevates Persian nobles, appoints Persians to positions that the Macedonians once assumed were theirs by right of conquest. He stages a new center of gravity. It is a calculated humiliation, a demonstration. You want to test the king? Fine. Watch him build a world without you. For days, the Macedonians sit in their camp and stew in something worse than anger: irrelevance. They have always believed they were essential, that Alexander's greatness was inseparable from Macedonian steel. Now they watch the king act like their steel is optional. This is the pressure point of the entire campaign. Not logistics, not tactics, identity. A Macedonian soldier's pride is not merely personal, it is structural. It is the belief that Macedonia, once a rough kingdom on the edge of the Greek world, has become the spearhead of history. That they are the chosen instrument of domination. When Alexander courts Persian elites and trains Persian soldiers, he is not just expanding the army. He is rewriting the story of who matters. And that is intolerable. So the mutiny collapses into something else. Submission. The Macedonians come to him, not as a mob this time, but as men who understand what they have done. They plead. They beg for reconciliation. They accept blame. This is one of those moments history loves to paint as triumphant unity. Alexander forgiving his men, the army restored, the bond renewed. But if you look closely, it isn't clean. It is a truce formed under the shadow of fear. Alexander accepts them back, but not without a ritual that makes the lesson permanent. He stages a massive banquet, Macedonians and Persians together, drinking and feasting under the same command. A symbolic fusion, a public declaration that the future will not belong exclusively to the old guard. In the immediate sense, it works. The army returns to obedience. The machine continues. But the cost is hidden inside the reconciliation. Because something has changed. The Macedonians have learned that Alexander will kill them if he must, that he will replace them if he can. And Alexander has learned something equally dangerous, that the men who carried him across the world can turn on him when their pride is threatened. That knowledge doesn't vanish because everyone hugs it out. It becomes a hairline fracture in the foundation of the empire. Opis is the moment Alexander reaches the limits of command by love. Up to this point, he has been more than a king. He has been a myth in motion, a young man who shares danger, who bleeds beside his soldiers, who leads charges personally, who remembers names, who rewards courage. That kind of leadership is intoxicating. It makes an army believe that obedience is loyalty, not coercion. Opis exposes the truth beneath it. Even in the most charismatic army in history, power is still power. It rests on the ability to punish. After Opis, Alexander continues to plan like a man who believes his work has just begun. Arabia, new campaigns, new reforms, new projects that require time. Time he assumes history will grant him. But history does not grant. It takes. Less than a year later, Alexander is dead in Babylon. Suddenly, the fusion he tried to engineer becomes a question without a referee. Macedonian generals who tolerated Persian integration under Alexander begin to strip it away when it threatens their share. The marriages unravel, the unity dissolves. The army that once conquered the world fractures into rival armies. And the irony is sharp enough to cut. Alexander's mistake may not have been that he tried to merge cultures. That part is almost inevitable if you want an empire rather than a raiding party. The mistake was believing he could remake identity faster than resentment grows. He was trying to build a world where Macedonian and Persian could sit at the same table and call it home. But he built it on the backs of men who still thought of home as the hills of Macedonia, and the names of dead friends in foreign soil. Opis is what happens when an empire tries to move from conquest to governance, and the conquerors realize the reward for victory is transformation. The soldiers at Opis do not stop loving Alexander because he loses. They stop loving him because he wins too completely, because victory changes the winner. It forces him to become the thing he overthrew, a ruler of a mixed world, a king who must think in systems instead of friendships, a man who can't simply be first among comrades anymore. And in that shift, the myth cracks. Alexander keeps his throne at Opis. He keeps his army. He keeps the appearance of unity. But he doesn't get back what he had in the beginning, an army that follows because it wants to. After Opis, they follow because they have learned what happens if they don't. That is the quiet moral cost of building something too large for any single identity to hold. The mutiny fails. The empire survives. The king wins. And yet, in the dust of Opis, you can already see the shape of what comes next. An empire that is vast, brilliant, and fundamentally personal. An empire that cannot outlive the man who holds it together with his own hands.